vehicle safely off the ground, we can begin installation of the RCE regular guy springs. Remove the passenger wheel to gain access to the lower strut and spindle. Remove the two 19mm bolts and nuts that connect the lower strut to the spindle. The upper bolt is the camber bolt, and you may want to use a scribe or a grease pen to mark the camber bolt's position. This step is not shown in the video but is recommended to restore the factory alignment settings. Once installation is complete, it is recommended that you have an alignment on the vehicle. Remove the brake line and ABS line retainer bolts that are 12mm. Make sure to separate these from the strut. Loosen the three 12mm nuts that secure the strut assembly to the chassis. Make sure to leave at least 2 nuts connected to the strut top mount bolt. While supporting the strut body with your right hand, separate the strut from the spindle by using your left hand to pull the spindle and brake assembly away from the strut. Now support the strut body with your left hand and remove the 2 remaining nuts securing the strut to the chassis of the car. Once these nuts are removed, remove the entire strut assembly from the vehicle. With the strut assembly off the car, remove the dust cap located in the center of the strut top mount. This will expose the nut that secures the strut top mount to the strut. Using an impact wrench, remove the 12mm strut nut while another person provides downward force on the strut top and carefully holds the strut in place. Remove the nut from the strut top mount. Remove the concaved washer and the strut top, including the rubber perch. Slide the spring off the lower strut and remove the dust boot. Now let's break down the front strut. Before you can replace the factory spring with the RCE regular guy spring, you should replace the factory bump stop with the shorter bump stop designed by RaceComp. Flip over the remaining strut assembly and locate the 14mm nut that secures the strut to the strut body. Remove the nut while the strut assembly is carefully secured by another person. Slide the strut out of the strut body, exposing the factory bump stop. Remove the factory bump stop by using force to slide the factory bump stop off the strut rod. The RCE bump stop provides greater suspension travel as the result of its shorter height as compared to the factory bump stop. Transfer a liberal amount of grease from the factory bump stop to the shorter RCE bump stop, spreading it evenly across the RCE piece. Gently pull the cone-shaped end of the RCE bump stop onto the end of the strut rod. Carefully reinsert the strut into the strut body and make sure the threaded rod comes out the opposite end of the strut body. Install the nut and torque it to 29 foot-pounds. Flip over the remaining strut assembly and reinstall the dust boot. Reassemble the new RCE spring, making sure to align the spring properly in the bottom of the spring perch. Fit the upper rubber perch over the RCE spring and fit the strut top onto the upper rubber perch by using the 2 rubber pieces as guides. Reinstall the concave washer with the highest point sloping from the center outward. Verify that the spring remains properly seated in the lower spring perch during this process. While another person compresses the spring so that the upper strut top slides past the threaded section of the strut rod end, reinstall the upper strut mount and secure it with the original nut. Torque the nut to 40.6 foot-pounds. Using your left hand, reinsert the entire strut assembly up into place from within the wheel well, and using your right hand, reinstall the nuts that secure the strut top mount to the chassis, tightening them until hand tight. Reinsert the camber bolt and lower bolt that secure the lower strut assembly to the spindle. Before tightening the camber bolt and nut, line up the scribe or grease marks on the camber bolt to ensure that we restore the original camber specs. While holding the camber bolt in place, tighten the nut onto the camber bolt. Tighten the lower bolt and nut. Reinstall the ABS line, torquing the nut to 24 foot-pounds. Reinstall the brake line support and torque the nut to 24 foot-pounds as well. Torque the lower strut bolts and nuts to 129 foot-pounds. Torque the strut top mount nuts to 14 foot-pounds. Finally, reinsert the strut top dust cover. Repeat the process for the other side of the vehicle. Installation of the RCE springs on the rear requires removal of the luggage floor mat. This will give us access to the top of the rear struts. Loosen but don't remove the two strut top mount nuts. Installation of the rear RCE springs is slightly different than on the front because it requires removal of the sway bar end link bolt and nut where the bolt slides through the rear control arm. Removal of this hardware will allow the rear control arms to droop just enough to slide the rear strut out of the control arm. Remove the 17mm nut from the 17mm bolt connecting the strut to the rear control arm. This may require a breaker bar. With the 17mm nut removed, carefully knock the 17mm bolt out of the control arm by hitting it with a dead blow hammer. Unload the suspension and make sure the control arms hang as low as possible. While the suspension is unloaded, remove the rear strut from the control arm. Remove the two 14mm strut top mount nuts that connect the strut to the chassis. Now you can remove the entire strut from the vehicle. Remove the nut that connects the strut top mount to the upper strut using an impact gun and a 17mm deep socket. Remove the strut top mount and the strut top, exposing the spring and dust boot. Remove the spring and dust boot, exposing the factory bump stop. Slide the factory bump stop off the strut rod and slide on the new RCE replacement. Reinstall the dust boot. Reassemble the new RCE spring, making sure to align the spring properly in the bottom of the spring perch. With the RCE spring seated in place, install the top perch and 17mm nut. Tighten, then torque this nut to 18.4 foot-pounds. Reinstall the entire strut on the car by sliding the upper strut top mount through the two holes in the chassis and hand tightening the two 14mm nuts. Reinsert the lower strut bolt where the strut meets the rear control arm. Tighten and torque the nut to 89 foot-pounds. Reinsert the 14mm sway bar end link bolt through the rear control arm, then tighten the sway bar end link bolt nut and torque it to 33 foot-pounds. Finally, tighten and torque the strut top mount nuts to 22 foot-pounds and repeat this entire process for the other side. Periodically check and verify that all bolts and nuts are torqued to their factory specifications. As with all major changes to the ride height of your vehicle, you should make sure to have the car lined by a professional. Now you can go out and enjoy your RCE springs.